If you find yourself walking along the remote sections of the southeastern shores of the Big Island of Hawaii, you might wonder why there is such an unusual amount of marine debris. Driftwood, fishing floats, nets, all kinds of plastic, and lots of sea glass. Why does all this stuff end up here? Well, it all has to do with a massive system of ocean currents known as the North Pacific Subtropical Gyre. This gyre is a slow-moving clockwise rotation of currents that spans the northern Pacific Ocean. It's formed by four major currents: North Pacific, California, North Equatorial, and the Kuroshio Current off the coast of Japan. Trash, lost fishing gear, and floating objects that enter this gyre, especially from East Asia, can circulate for years. Much of this material collects in the infamous Great Pacific Garbage Patch, but some of it escapes the gyre and travels on long oceanic journeys, riding seasonal wind shifts and eddies. The Big Island's southeastern coast is perfectly positioned to catch this debris. Trade winds and winter swells often push floating objects from the gyre onto its rugged lava shores. One of the most treasured finds from these currents are Japanese glass fishing floats. These were used by Japanese fishermen starting in the early 1900s to keep their long fishing nets afloat. The floats were blown by hand and often bear markings or stamps from the glassmaker. While most were phased out by the 1960s and replaced with plastic, some still drift ashore decades later, having been at sea for half a century or more. Glass floats were once common in Hawaii, but today they're extremely rare. Most were collected decades ago, and with fewer washing ashore and more beachcombers looking, it's become almost impossible to find them in Hawaii. However, you can still find pieces of Japanese floats in Hawaii, like this one here. This is the button or pontal mark of a glass float, a thick circular seal where the glassblower detached the float from the pontal or blowing rod and sealed the opening with extra molten glass. Often domed or indented, this area is denser than the rest of the float and has a nipple-like bump where molten glass was forced through the hole left by the blowing rod. These buttons are commonly found intact as sea glass because they are the thickest and strongest part of the float. When a float breaks, the thinner walls usually shatter and erode away, but the button tends to survive. Because most of the Big Island is extremely rocky, glass that gets washed up is usually broken, and these little shards are typically all that's left of a glass float. I've found a lot of these buttons of varying colors. They are the last remnants of glass floats you're likely to find in Hawaii nowadays, unless you're extremely lucky. Fortunately, you can still find plenty of regular sea glass on the Big Island, like this lovely blue piece that was likely once part of a soda bottle. Or this honey amber piece likely from an old whiskey or beer bottle. If you look closely at this button, you'll notice that it's actually made up of two different colors of glass. Like I mentioned before, glass makers would seal the float by adding an extra blob of molten glass on top of the blowpipe scar. But sometimes they would use a different batch of glass to do this, and sometimes that separate batch would be a different color. That's how you get this beautiful multicolored effect. Most traditional Japanese glass floats were made from recycled sake bottles, which is why you often see shades of green and aqua. But depending on the source glass, you'll also find rarer blues, ambers, and even clear or lavender hues. Black sea glass is actually very dark green, olive, or brown glass that only looks black until held up to a strong light. It often comes from old beer, wine, or liquor bottles and can date back over 100 years. Because rum bottles were often stored in this type of glass, some people call it pirate's glass. This glass float button is pretty special. It still has a visible maker's mark, despite being broken and heavily worn. One of the best resources for identifying glass float marks is this book, which catalogs over 380 different markings. After flipping through it, I was able to match mine to a DG mark. That stands for Daiichi Glass Company, which operated out of Hokkaido, Japan, and produced floats from the 1930s to the 1960s. It's amazing to think about the journey this float took to eventually wash up on the southeastern shore of Hawaii.